everyone. This is Sanaaz, and here we have Hardie Meriman, president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, who has over 20 years of experience in nonviolent civil resistance. Hello, Hardie. Thank you so much for being with us and accepting our invitation. It's great to meet you. So let me start our discussion with the question of how do we recognize a movement as a living movement? How do we know that it's working?
It's a good question. You know, a lot of people will look at public mobilization, how big the protests are, as like their main indicator if a movement is still going or not. And I would actually say, I think that's probably not what we should be looking at most. I think there are other things to look at. And so I, for example, will look at unity. Are we seeing a level of unity of goals and purpose and strategy in people over time? Maybe those people aren't all publicly mobilizing all the time, but if there's a level of unity, then that's one indicator that a movement is there and also increasing.
Yeah.
Another thing that I look at is strategy. And when I say that, I'm not just looking at does the movement have a plan? I'm looking at is the movement investing in training? Is the movement investing in building the skills and the capacities and the strategic decision making of its people? And again, that doesn't necessarily involve public protests.
Yeah, but how can movements find their own strategies, the right one, the effective strategies?
How can a movement develop its most effective strategy?
How can they find it at first place and then to develop it?
Well, there's different ways to think about it. So one way of thinking about it is that you invest very heavily in analysis at the beginning of a movement. And this can be done with a small group of people. And it's really important virtually once your movement starts and really starts becoming more public, it becomes very difficult to ever find the time to do in-depth analysis again. So it's important to invest at the beginning or in quiet periods in deep analysis.
Yeah.
You look at you do a self-assessment. Where is our movement strong? Where is it weak? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? You also look at the movement's opponent. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? What are the opportunities and threats there? And you do a lot of listening to different groups in society. You can analyze different groups in society, what they care about. That kind of detailed work is a great foundation to start a movement, to start to build a strategy. If you don't have that, you have to come up with some shortcuts. And I think one of the most important things for movements to do is to define what the single most important things, well, the top maybe 3 to 5 things that they think matter are for their goals. And those things, usually it's pretty important that they be actually inside of the movement. So here's what I mean by that. So a movement that has a goal to change a major policy or to end a dictatorship and get democracy, for example. If the main thing it's looking at is, has the dictatorship ended or has the terrible policy changed? That movement might actually be winning, but it actually thinks that it's losing because it's looking at this one thing that may take years to change. In fact, the movement might be doing many things that are right, and they may actually be building strength and winning, but they're not going to know that if they're only looking at something outside of themselves. So it's important for movements to define, in English we say metrics, their own indicators, their own qualities that they want to build within themselves over time that they can control. And so some of those qualities that really contribute to movement success are things like unity. Again, things like strategic planning capacity and skill building. Nonviolent discipline is another, which means the ability of a movement to remain nonviolent. Another one would be that you can track is, are we seeing evidence of defections from the other side? Are we seeing that there's a growing number of people that supported our opponent that now don't support our opponent? And yes, are we seeing growing numbers of supporters at public actions is another one. So those are the kinds of things you might set aside as indicating what success means to you, which is a critical part of achieving your ultimate goal.
If there are different groups of people, like different groups of activists, for example, or parties or people, one would be reformists, what would be communists or leftists, what would be liberals, for example. How do we make a coalition when there's the different view of each, and then also many things in common as purpose? But how do we make it work like this?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. So coalitions, we think sometimes that coalitions will form because people have a common political interest, like they're all against the same opponent, and sometimes that happens. But coalitions, because we're all human, what really causes them to work is trust.
Yeah.
Shared political interest is helpful, but it's really not enough. It involves trust, and trust, unfortunately, as we know, as human beings, can take time to build. And sometimes it takes more than just words. Sometimes it takes action. Sometimes it takes showing solidarity with others. So, for example, if we look at Egypt, shortly before 2011, there was a strike by garment workers or clothing workers in Suez.
Yeah.
And you had students and young people in capitals like in the capital like Cairo or in cities like Alexandria that actually showed solidarity with those workers. They were from different economic classes. They had different goals, but the students actually showed solidarity with the workers and showed up at to support them.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things build trust. And so coalitions function and they work and they grow at the speed of trust, as we say. And then another thing to think about is that there's two different kinds of coalitions. There are negative coalitions and positive coalitions. So negative coalitions are clear about what they're against. Positive coalitions are clear about what they want to achieve. Negative coalitions can form quickly when there's a shared threat. And everyone can agree when there's a shared threat, oh my gosh, there's terrible abuse happening. Okay, we all are angry about that. Or the price of fuel just rose a lot. Okay, all of us are affected by that. The challenge with negative coalitions, though, is that they don't tend to last when the threat is gone. You can get big mobilization with negative coalitions, but again, it's difficult to sustain.
Yeah.
Positive coalitions take longer to form. They require more trust. But if you're looking at trying to build democracy, it's really important to also start to develop positive coalitions. Because what we frequently see is if there's a democratic transition, and the democratic transition came because of a negative coalition only, the minute the transition comes, the negative coalition starts to dissolve. People don't feel threatened anymore. They start pursuing their separate interests. It is very difficult to then get democracy afterwards. If you have a positive coalition, again, it takes longer to build, but can actually have an agenda and push for it and keep unity even after a political transition has happened.
Exactly. And is this the place that we need somehow a leadership or a leader? And how can that be important, the role of a leader or a collective leader? What do you think of that?
Mm-hmm.
For example,
I
in the
think
case of Iran, the role of Prince Reza Pahlavi as a trusted leader, as people call him.
mm-hmm. I think when I think of movements, I think of different kinds of leadership. So I don't think of leader, I immediately think of leaders and different kinds of leaders. There are different kinds of leaders that movements need at different times. There's a famous organizer and who later American organizer who later in his career became also a bit of a scholar, and his name is Bill Moyer. And Moyer basically said, look, there's four different sort of leader types in movements, and they're all needed, but they're not all needed at exactly the same time. And so the first type he called citizens. I would call them people who do mainstreaming. Citizens are people who basically say to the population, look, these protesters, these activists, we shouldn't treat them as dangerous. We shouldn't treat them as like disorder. We should actually say, look, what they're fighting for is what we all want. They make it much safer to protest or to take action because they say, look, this is consistent with our traditions, culturally, religiously, and politically, with our highest goals as a country. Okay, so that's important, right? Because if you don't have mainstreamers or citizens, and those are sometimes leaders, activists become viewed as a dangerous element and then they're repressed. So they try to sort of mainstream everything to make it societal. But then you also have a second kind of leadership, which he called rebels, right? These are people who take big risks. These are people who are often the first to show up and really organize, right? And so rebels are also critical because without rebels, things usually don't get started. They don't rebels also sort of model the kinds of sacrifices that are sometimes needed. But then you have a third kind of leadership, which he called change agents. And change agents are local level leaders who organize in their communities. They're not known nationally, but they're leaders in their communities and they have a lot of respect. So let's say that your big issue nationally is corruption and you want some legislation around that. Change agents will talk to people in their communities and say, corruption is the issue. What does this mean for us here? How do we see it? And what changes do we want? That's critical because a lot of people engage in politics based on how it affects their particular local situation, and change agents localize issues. And then the fourth is what he called reformers, which are people who actually can take the power of a movement and start to convert that power into changes in institutions, changes in policy, changes in government. And so you need those all four. You need them at different times. Sometimes those different kinds of leadership can also conflict with each other. And it's really important for movements to recognize that there's no one leader usually who can do it all, that multiple kinds of leaders are needed, and that it's important for them to recognize again that even while they conflict, and even while one may be more important at one time than another, that to really get change, you usually need all four.
Four of them that you already mentioned, I don't know, they seem to be like some kind of temporary leaders or leadership. So at some point of time, they can be workable for the movement or for whatever purpose that people have in their mind for changes. But we do need a leader to, I don't know, to be there, right? To be trusted and to have an organized purpose to somehow also unite everyone. The only, for example, option that people always had the trust of, and it was somehow growing until now, it's been Prince Reza Pahlavi. I want to see how is the role of such a leader, a trusted leader as a single leader is important. Can it be anything against a collective leader, and how is that one?
Yeah. So in a highly repressive environment where there's authoritarians are being brutal, obviously there's a real risk in having a centralized leader that they get killed or bribed or corrupted or whatever, right? So in addition to the question of like, do people trust them? There's also the question of like, like will people start to depend on them too much so that if they suddenly get taken out, what does the movement left with, right? So for this reason, it's really important for movements to invest in local level training and strategy. Because if you have a centralized leader who's wonderful and people can agree on that's fantastic, but it's always a risk of dependency. So you need to understand that your movement will need to be have plans prepared to function without such a leader, even if they're wonderful, because leaders get killed, leaders get thrown in
So
jail,
it works
and
with
leaders
that
sometimes
one,
just
works
make
with the
terrible decisions.
education.
What'd you say?
That purpose would work with the education, educating people, you
Right.
say.
It's all of it. Yeah, training is incredibly important. I can't say that enough. If actually, I will say one other thing about training, and then I'll get back to the leadership question. So being an activist and an organizer is one of the hardest and most important jobs in the world. We know why it's hard, right? Of course, you're up against a really tough opponent, all of that. But there's another reason why it's hard that people don't think about as much, which is that being an activist or an organizer requires a lot of skills. And there's very little structured process for people to develop those skills. So a lawyer gets to go through years of law school, and then they take exams, and then they are licensed, and then they can go in court. An engineer has years of training. The best research gets brought into their profession every year. They get mentorship. They engage with other engineers. They learn. They get a license, and then they maybe can design a bridge, right? A soldier goes through a certain structured set of training. All of this is based on the idea that when people develop skills and knowledge that are relevant to their very important jobs, that's it. It's worth making that investment in them. In fact, that investment is necessary. It's essential. Activists don't have that. Their job is just as hard as any other job I just mentioned and just as complicated, but activists don't have a structured set of learning. So part of what happens is people try to learn through whatever way they can because they're resourceful, but it's still not the same as really having clear training programs that go over time. And so I think that's again, like movements will say sometimes, yes, but that takes a lot of work. It does take a lot of work. There's no question. But it's what we know that this is one of the most important ways that movements increase their success rates over time is through that investment. I think that part of the challenge in a place where civil society and unions and syndicates have been outlawed and repressed so much is that there's not a structure for the movement to sort of to use to negotiate. So like a movement it can be decentralized, it can create lots of power, but it can't easily convert that power into a change because at key points when it needs a centralized structure or leadership to negotiate, it doesn't have that. And that's exactly what autocrats want. They want to create that challenge for movement. It's really hard. Traditionally, unions have been able to play that role because they can mobilize people, but they also have structure. As a movement, it's really important to strategize more at the beginning about we know we're going to get to that point, so what do we do? A lot of times that point seems distant. People think, well, we'll figure it out when we get there. And suddenly they're in a situation they didn't prepare for. Wait a minute, we have lots of people protesting, but we actually have no way of communicating our demands clearly. That's a problem. Part of the unity that can be created is unity around here's what we all agree a transition process should look like. These are the 4 elements or 5 elements or whatever of a transition process that we all agree on, and this is what we're demanding. And so even just having unity on that can be really critical at the outset, right?
Yeah, I
We
think
don't,
I think that's
yep.
that's what Iranians already really have, because
Mhm.
there are things that have been said. For example, democracy that everybody is following, the territorial integrity of nation of Iran, which is really important. In case of Iran, please be specific on this. That you talk very nice, but it was more general. Let us be more specific on the case of Iran. There are things that everybody's agreed on being said from Prince Reza Pahlavi. So, and there've been so many people inside Iran who've been in prison or have been in horrible dangers, who expressed their support for the leadership of Prince. That's why we talk about it. This is very important to be talked of. I want to know your opinion. How do you see this role?
Yeah. Well, I think a few things. So as someone who is not Iranian, I will never know the local context as well as people who are from Iran and particularly people who are in Iran right now. And that knowledge is absolutely essential to developing a strategy. So as an outsider, I'm pretty careful when I comment on other people's situations because I recognize that I don't know their situation nearly as well as they do. I also know that in order to win, one thing that really helps movements is the general sort of social science knowledge of what works, what has worked in other places. So that's why I try to share that. Um, I would say that in situations where you have done many things that I think are strategically probably correct and or consistent with what's worked in other places, and it's still not working. Um, 2 things. One is I would continue to go back and say, are we as united as we can be? Were there limits in that? Where do we need to continue building unity? If let's rank our unity between 1 and 10. If it was a 7, can we make it an 8? Okay. Have we invested in strategy particularly so that we are able to go beyond cycles of protest? Because cycles of protest, people stop showing up eventually. They're easy for governments to repress. Are we creating maximum economic pressure? Were we able to get the maximum economic pressure that we needed through acts of what we call non-cooperation, strikes or boycotts? Is that a weakness? Do we need to figure out how to do that next time? And various other things. Do that self-analysis because there are always areas of improvement. The second thing is to look at the opponent, look at the government. And all governments that are brutal depend on a few key pillars of support, right? And some of them are in the security, right? And I say some of them because it's not just one pillar. There's the military, there's various branches of the military, there are police, there's intelligence, and so forth. And one thing that we're seeing more commonly with movements according to my colleague Erica Chenoweth, is they're having a harder time getting defections from these key pillars of support, particularly the security forces over the last 10, 15 years. And so that is a question of like, if the defections aren't happening, why are they not happening? And when you talk about like what your future for the country is, there are two audiences for that. One is the movement itself, but the other is everyone who's currently in the government who's wondering, if I defect, what am I defecting to? What's going to happen to me? And it's really important to be able to have them know what's going to happen to them.
People who've been involved in killing, in murdering, in torturing, so they're going to have their course and they're going to have the results of their actions. But people who've been in military, who've been in government, but that they have no history on that, or they have less history, that any way that everybody should be sure that it's only in the court that the result of the action would be clear. And there have been so many military people who have said that they're ready to go forward. But that's also another question, that how can the whole military, because it's really dependent on military, right? So when there's the people and there's only the people, I doubt if the revolution can really happen, because it should be somehow with both, right? With the power of the military and also the people. And but how the military can be sure that, yeah, this is the time, this is the minute of showing up.
I don't have an answer to that. And I think this is where local level knowledge is incredibly important, and local level conversations and local level trust building. And sometimes trust is built through, I mean, sometimes trust doesn't exist between two groups and you need another group to start going between them. But I can't comment on that with Iran because I don't know the specifics. And I know that the specifics change regularly too. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more satisfying answer, other than a lot depends on trust and a lot depends on local circumstances.
Yeah. Thank you anyway, because we have not much time anyway, but let me choose what to ask for the last ones. For example, there are tactics of anti-movements that we see. Actions from anti-movements, they do lots of things to weaken us, to weaken the movement, to weaken the people, and many of this come from people who had had some trust on, and then at some point people know that these were from the government, for God's sake, or they've been working for them. People who work as opposition, apparently, and
Right.
then the truth comes out that they've been never there, they've been just playing. And
Yes.
so there've been different tactics, like complicated. Over time, it got more and more complicated. What do you say about that? And how can we win this conflict?
Well, I mean, again, Iranians will deal with that in the way that makes the most sense for them. But one thing that I have seen in other movements is, so if movements have a very clear code of conduct, here is how we do things, here's the kinds of things we do, here's the kinds of things we don't do, here's how we make decisions. If they're clear on those things, and here are the goals that we're looking for, then part of what they can look for is who's outside of that code of conduct, who's operating outside of that code of conduct. And the reason that that's really important is because, or one reason that's really important is because if a movement starts trying to figure out who's infiltrating the movement, it can lead to all kinds of accusations that destroy trust really fast. And so some movements, for example, will say, if you accuse anyone of being an infiltrator, you have to have clear proof. Clear proof. Otherwise, don't do it. Because if you do it, then who knows? Maybe the infiltrator is actually accusing others, and like it just creates huge problems. So if you're going to accuse someone, you need really clear proof. But otherwise, people can be part of this movement if they stay within these clear guidelines. And when they start to go out because they're trying to create, to do things that are really strategically harmful, then we're kicking them out, not because we think they're an informant, we're kicking them out because they're not operating in our strategic guidelines. So that's one way to think about that movements have thought about this problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, dear Hardy.